We're going to look at sculpture today, and then we are going to do a discussion on consumer culture, but really trying to get at the sculptural pieces of Jeff Koons, who is a contemporary sculptor and is someone well represented here in Los Angeles. If you go to the Broad Museum, you'll see that there is a large collection, including the balloon dog, including the Michael Jackson sculpture and the tulips. There's a large collection of his paintings as well. So let's get into sculpture. Now, I have to say that I am a painter and I draw, but my favorite kind of art is sculpture. And I like it because it's real and three-dimensional rather than something that's passive and on a wall. So a lot of what I'm going to show you today is stuff that I have seen or that I have experienced in some way. And I will kind of try to use my experiences as part of kind of describing what part of the lecture that this is and trying to get you to understand what sculpture is. So this slide here, we're looking at Maurizio Cattelan. Cattelan might be best known for the comedian piece that he did, where he taped a banana to a wall, I think at a Miami Basel, which is a huge art fair. And then he priced it for $100,000. And then I believe he actually ate the banana off the wall as part of it. But what I mostly knew of Maurizio Cattelan, he also made a gold toilet too. So I like him for a lot of reasons. But I knew him for these hyper-realistic sculptures that he did. And again, usually something with some sort of sense of humor to them. I think one of the more remarkable installations he ever did. So the sculpture is at the very top here. We're looking at the Pope John Paul II, I'm assuming, and he has been hit by a meteorite and he's down. And karma has come back to roost for the Pope for all the stuff that has been going on there. And Cattelan is Italian, so he would know about the abuses of the Catholic Church quite well. It looks like he's okay, though, but he's down. And you can see that the meteorite probably crashed through a window overhead. Now, the bottom image is an installation. And in this installation, where it's not just about the single sculpture, but it's about how the entire room itself or the entire space is transformed by sculpture and painting, installation. So for his show at the Guggenheim, where normally you would put your artwork in the galleries kind of going down in a spiral through the Guggenheim, he hung all of his from the center atrium. So when you take your trip through the Guggenheim, and again, you walk in a spiral down this way with the atrium being open with a large oculus, what you would see is all of the sculptures kind of combined, hung from strings. That is an installation there. Another great sculptor who's contemporary that I love quite a lot is Takashi Murakami. And what I love about Murakami is the audaciousness, the scale of his work, and his relationship to manga, anime culture in his cartoonish figures, but also his really large sculptures of Mr. D.O.B. And I think that could be a Mr. D.O.B. possibly on the right. On the left, we're looking at his really famous, you probably have even seen them, flowers with the big happy grins that they have. And he has installed these in the Hall of Mirrors in Versailles, a palace of King Louis XIV. So he has taken this palace from the late 16, early 1700s and transformed this Western European absolutist king space into 20th century pop. And I like the way that that grates. The flowers have been described as being so happy they're demented, which I also love. Okay, so let's get into the nuts and bolts of kind of trying to describe what sculpture is. This is a Louise Bourgeois, again, a sculpture that I've experienced. So sculpture in the round is about, with sculpture, it's not like a painting where you just gaze at it and move on. With sculpture, you have to move around it. You have to check the back. You have to check the sides, underneath it in this case. And I remember with Maman that when I first saw it, from about where the photo is being taken, that I was really kind of frightened by it, by the huge bronze, the spindly legs. And then as I slowly walked underneath the legs to the abdomen, I had this strange feeling of being protected by the spider, not like it was going to hurt me. Underneath the abdomen, there were colorful spools of thread. So this stands in for Louise's mother, who was a seamstress and who protected her fiercely. And the exact experience that I had was the exact intention of the experience that one would have with this sculpture. One of the more remarkable things about this sculpture is Louise made this in her 90s. So Louise Bourgeois was making great artwork, great sculpture in her 80s and her 90s. And it's hard to imagine that there are too many professions where you get at your best at that age. So really there are kind of three ways to understand or experience sculpture. Sculpture in the round, which we just saw from Louise Bourgeois, low relief or bas relief, which we see in the sarcophagus lid from the Mayans. And we have in this limestone, we have Pakal, the Mayan ruler, here, and he is about to die, and his knees are drawn up, his head is tilted back, and he's falling from life into death. The gods are here to accompany him, and the Mayan reliefs are cut into it. So there's a little bit of the third dimension here. You can't see the back of Pakal. You can't see the sides, really. You can just see from the lighting here, which is on the top, and the shadows here, that there is a little bit, a low relief or a bas relief. And again, very different than sculpture in the round. High relief is a little more than the bas, than the low relief. So here in this sarcophagus from the Romans, we have not cut out the figures completely. We cannot walk around these figures to see them. We do see, though, most of the face. We do see almost the entire deltoid here. We see the elbow, and we can probably see the back of it. So it's a higher relief rather than the low relief. So high relief, low relief, sculpture in the round. Now, how do we make sculptures? So there are basically 4 different ways to go about making sculpture. One is modeling, another one is casting. So with modeling, this is a sculpture by Michael Manelli. Michael Manelli is sculpting in Sculpey, a little clay, and then he is showing us an image from the Vietnam War of a girl who was lit on fire by napalm. On the right is Charlie Ray, and this would be cast. Casting is an industrial process where typically you make a clay mold and then you put wax around it, and then you take the wax and surround it maybe with rubber or something so that mold can be used over and over again, and then you put something liquid in it. It could be liquid plastic, could be liquid metal, could be porcelain, all kinds of something that could be liquefied and then made hard. Charlie Ray, who is a sculptor in Los Angeles, he taught at UCLA. He has taken a car, and then that car, he has cast every single piece of that car. And this was a car that was in a fatal collision. And it has a kind of chilling aspect of being just this gray sculpture that's unpainted. And then the other two forms of making sculpture are carving and assembling. So carving, you think about marble and Michelangelo carving away in marble with a chisel, sandpapering. This is a form of carving here also by Charlie Ray, but this was done by robots. So robot Dremels created this figure here out of a solid piece of steel. Normally steel sculptures would be cast and would be hollow, but this one is solid of this a really large figure here. She's big. I remember standing around it and getting a sense of the size. And then the last kind of way that you can make a sculpture is assembling, where you take different pieces and you put them together. And we'll get a really good look at that at the end of the lecture from a Chris Burden called Metropolis 2. This is Medusa Head by Chris. This has railroad tracks and cement and is hung from a chain, and the whole thing has been assembled together. So modeling. Modeling, we typically think of ceramics using clay hollowed out in the middle and then fired. Let me just show you quickly here. So this is kind of how you might model something that you might fire in an oven and make it into a ceramic. So you've got the clay, they've got the newspaper and the inside to make it hollow. They've got it on a wheel, they're using their hands and they're using burnishers. And then they're going to take the clay and wet it down in places. And then they're going to add clay to it. Again, burnishing it down, using the hands, very hands-on, like when we studied the drawing lecture and we saw charcoal. And he is doing a copy of a Xavier Messerschmitt, a sculptor from the 1700s. So now he's putting this thing on this pedestal. And again, you can see the wooden tools, how he added the ears on. And eventually, once you finish with this, it would look something like that. Okay, so imagine that, but instead of making that head, we made this woman here, this what's known as a voluptuous lady. So this is a Mayan, and this is made out of clay. The clay was painted. You can see some of the paint here. It would be hollow when it was put in the oven and turned into a ceramic. And so what happens to the clay is it turns hard, and it becomes brittle when it's hard. You could break it. You couldn't really break the wet clay. You could certainly change the way it looked by putting your thumb in it, but it doesn't have a glass-like quality. So modeling. Casting, this is a casted bronze here that is gilded with a bit of gold. We are seeing a bodhisattva here, and the bodhisattva has the elements of Buddhism in terms of the mudras, sitting on the lotus leaf, things that we had seen earlier when we studied iconography in our third lecture. So this is made from a process called lost wax. You start with that clay core, then you put, maybe a quarter of an inch of clay to half an inch of clay around it. You put then these rods into it with pins driven into the core. Then you would cover then the wax rods with clay, or if you want to reuse this and turn it into a matrix, you might cover it in rubber, so that way you can remake it. Then you heat it up, and when you heat it up, all of the wax here, and then the wax rods that were here, all of them are going to melt, and that's going to leave a hollow interior. When you have that hollow interior, then you can pour molten bronze, you could pour molten plastic, molten steel, and then it'll cover the empty areas. And then you can either, depending on what you did for the outside part, you could either break it or you simply slit it, and if it's rubber, you just cut it apart so you can reuse it. And then you clean up whatever's left on the outside, and then you have a bronze cast. So you could do this with a car engine, pieces from the engine. You could do this with, you could build a number of industrial items, like the outside of your phone case, if it's metal or plastic, probably was made from some sort of casting process. So from the casting process, anything that's metal, anything that's liquefied can be used. So it could be metal, like bronze, or here in the case of this Jeff Koons, we have Michael Jackson, the king of pop, and Bubbles, his chimpanzee, and it is painted porcelain, and it's about life size. This is at the Broad Museum. So the porcelain can be liquefied and then turned into a cast, and there are several of these, and then painted like it's a kind of cheap religious statue that you might find with babies and lambs somewhere. And it's really amazing how big it is, and again, how kitschy it is at the same time. This is casting done out of plastic. Here in this Rachel Whiteread slide, we see her casting in plastic here, getting the in-between of two window planes, turning that invisible air into something hard. Here, we're seeing this, artist space that has been cast into cement. So the inside of the artist space is now cemented. The third way of making sculpture, so we had modeling, where we saw with the clay. We had casting, where we see this industrial process called the lost wax process. And now we see carving. And you're seeing the kind of hand strength and durability necessary for carving in stone. You're carving out of stone. You're probably getting your hands bloody. It's really tough work to do. And so you're cutting stone and smoothing stone, and after enough hours with the right kind of talent, you can make really kind of miraculously lifelike things, like Michelangelo does with David. We also saw this when we looked at the Olmec heads, when we were looking at Mesoamerican art as well. This is carved out of basalt, a volcanic rock. And the fourth kind of sculpture is assembling, where you're taking pieces and putting them together. So David Smith is working in a foundry. He's working in steel. He is creating probably casts of these rectangular objects, and then he is welding these objects together and assembling them. We see an assemblage here from Nancy Rubens, who also taught at UCLA. She has taken airplane parts, and she has been influenced by the assemblages that you would see from Antonio Gaudi in his architecture, and then also from Watts Towers, where Simon Rodia is using steel and cement and broken bottles and broken plates to create the towers. Here, Nancy Rubens is using parts of an airplane that are wound together as if they're in some sort of dervish. Here by Doris Salcido, we're seeing 1,550 chairs that are stacked between two buildings for a installation and assemblage. This is Tim Noble and Sue Webster. They've been taking piles of trash and then lighting the piles of trash. So the piles of trash themselves don't necessarily reveal a lot, but the silhouette of the shadow really shows with clarity what that pile of trash is. Another kind of interesting way of working on Plato's forms. of the, and say in his allegory of a cave, where the shadows are the real image rather than the objects used to make them. Of course, long history of human figure in sculpture. We see that here going back almost 5,000 years with Menkaure and Khmer. These are pharaohs. This is the smaller of the three pyramids at Giza, was built by Menkaure. We see the pharaohic headdress. We see the pharaohic beard. We see also the very similar kind of ways that pharaohs are depicted, with one leg forward, two arms at their sides, holding some sorts of scrolls. Not a lot of anatomy put into this, kind of like also early Greek sculpture of the Kouros, some similar qualities, although the Kouros come much later and are clearly influenced by the Egyptians. Now, this is not completely a sculpture in the round. It is a frontal sculpture. The back really doesn't have anything, so it was probably leaned up against a wall. And we're seeing Khmer, the wife, showing affection to her pharaohic husband. In China, we see an amazing array of thousands of life-size ceramics built, each one with an individual head, protecting the very first emperor of China, Qi Shi Huang. And this was built over probably, I would imagine, a few decades, with thousands of people, chariots. All the soldiers are holding actual weapons, most of which decayed over the 2,000 years. And then recently, in the last 30 years, the terracotta warriors were discovered and unearthed. Now, when working with the body in sculpture, there is a style that the Greeks popularized called contrapposto, so the counterpoise or counterbalance, where typically you're seeing an athlete at rest. So the athletic body with muscles, and then putting most of their weight on one leg. Now, of course, in stone, the stone would be so heavy that the thin human ankles could not support the weight of the stone. So typically there's some sort of armature on the leg that is resting all the weight. That might be a piece of wood or something else along those lines. And then the contrapposto, we see this kind of sloping curve here with the hips pointed up, the shoulders pointed down, and a very naturalistic kind of form. You see that also coming from Michelangelo a couple thousand years later, here with his dying slave. Again, the naked body resting on the one leg, and the symmetry of the body and the kind of realism and idealized face that you would see in the Greeks, rather than any human face. Here, this is a Kiki Smith from 1995, made out of beeswax, and we're looking at a person in a fetal position, and this maybe strange meanings that might come from that in terms of perhaps in a dream or being born. It's kind of hard to say exactly what it is. We also find sculpture out in the real world in time and place. The serpent mound here is earth that is covered in grass. The head of the serpent is here. The body of the serpent coils this way to the tail. So this would be a huge, huge sculpture that really couldn't be seen in its complete in the photo like this until you have the airplane or hot air balloons or something along those lines. Robert Smithson also is going out into space in the Spiral Jetty in the Great Salt Lake of Utah. This is a dump truck that went out into the lake and dumped materials into this spiral. Andy Goldsworthy is a Scottish artist who goes out in the mornings in nature, and he builds things using leaves, stacking rocks, and here he has taken ice and coiled the ice around a tree. So the idea of installations, which we've been looking at. So Thomas Hirschhorn here, this is his Jumbo Spoons and Big Cake. It's a installation where the artist is modifying the space and we kind of explore and experience that space. This looks like a giant, maybe high school science project. Another great installation is Red Grooms in his Ruckus Manhattan from 1975. These are paper mache people with newspapers and other items in a subway that you can actually walk through. The walls and things are painted. One of the more popular installations, probably in LA, is Yayoi Kusama's Fireflies on Water. So Kusama is an artist who was working in polka dots, a pop artist who kind of disappears from the art scene for mental health reasons. And at the Broad Museum, it still might be there, you can experience her Fireflies on Water. The room is about 12 feet by 12 feet, around 10 feet tall. There is a platform that you enter. The walls and the ceiling are mirrored. There is water then here. And there are several hundred lights suspended from the ceiling, but the reflections of the water, the reflections of the mirror, make it look like you're in a room that is infinitely big. And I think you're allowed in that room for a few seconds, and then there's a long line typically to get in there, but it's definitely worth experiencing. This is The Red Room by Louise Bourgeois. She did The Spider. When I saw this particular work, you can't look at it in the way that we're looking at it. You have to view it through the cracks between the doors, like a child spying on their parents. And it's a really unusual way to experience the work of art. Christo and Jean-Claude, they were doing installations, massive installations out in nature, like the gate project that they did in Central Park, or they wrapped the Reichstag in Germany, or they made this huge curtain in this mountain valley in Colorado, really changing huge areas of space very simply. In Los Angeles, we have The Levitating Mass by Michael Heiser. This is a giant boulder that was brought from Central California and then suspended amongst the over this tunnel here. And when you look at it somewhere where my cursor is pointing, it kind of looks like the rock is weightless rather than heavy. When you get underneath it, you can kind of feel the weight. The last artwork that I want to show you is a kinetic sculpture by Chris Burden. This is Metropolis 2. So Chris is a performance artist that we will be studying later on in our class. So Metropolis is a massive work of art that is housed at the LA County Museum of Art. It's got a sense of noise and a roar and a sound to it that captures kind of the energy of a city in many ways. Chris has either cast or carved or assembled all of the buildings. He's using steel and railroad car tracks and trains, and the cars are all cast, and when the cars are moving using gravity down the track, they're reaching speeds of over 100 miles an hour. And then it comes to the typical 405 stop and go traffic that you would experience in Los Angeles or Orange County while you're waiting for your chance to speed up again. And as it's slowly moving up the conveyor belt, it is ultimately released, and then boom, the speed starts again. It's really quite an amazing sculpture. And here at the end of the video, we begin to get a sense of the scale of it. Absolutely massive, absolutely loud like a city is. It's one of the great sculptures I've seen in Los Angeles, and highly, highly, highly recommend it as an experience. Okay, we are going to take a look now at consumer culture, and the sculpture of Jeff Koons. So you'll be taking a quiz on the sculpture section, and then also you'll be doing a lecture assessment of sculpture and the Jeff Koons lecture. So there'll be 2 assignments with Jeff Koons included in them. So the way to explain Jeff Koons and what he's doing with his massive colored steel sculptures is to understand the history of manufacturing, to understand conceptual and pop art, and to kind of see how that works in America and also has worked in art too. And that's what I'm going to try to explain here. So we're looking at Fordism in manufacturing. Manufacturing, which is an industrial process that uses the casting process that we studied in our 4 methods for making sculpture. So what Henry Ford did in making his cars is he standardized the product, everything made through machines, made through molds, not by craftsmanship, using special tools and equipment to make the assembly lines, and then with the assembly lines having workers only do one thing. So as the car is moving down the line, we're seeing people putting on the tires, putting the engine in, putting the doors on, and that's all you do all day. Now, today, the manufacturing assembly line for automobiles is done entirely by machines, so the human labor is out of it. But one of the things Henry Ford figured out was he had thousands of employees, and he wanted to pay them well enough that they could buy a car. So it used to be that working in factories, even though it wasn't a job where you had a lot of college degrees, you had specialized skills, and those specialized skills could make you middle-class wages. And a lot of that has disappeared from the United States. So manufacturing, really important to us winning a couple of wars. Manufacturing and factories are the reason that the North wins in the Civil War. It's also why we were able to fight 2 wars at the same time in Japan and in Germany, and ultimately come out on top with the help of our allies because of taking the car factories and quickly changing them from making cars to making weapons, and tanks in this case, as you're seeing here. We also see the industrialization idea in farming as well that helps to feed so many people in this country, using massive, massive tractors and harvesters. And rather than a farmer being able to farm just a couple of acres, now a couple of farmers with machines can harvest hundreds of acres. And then that industrialized spirit is also in the way that farm animals are being harvested too. So rather than these chickens running free, they are kept in pens and then fed as much food as possible. Meat is better when the muscles aren't too hardened from doing a lot of work. So you're keeping the chickens from moving too much and then feeding them. Definitely inhumane in terms of the quality of the chicken's life, but it also ensures that people are able to eat and afford food. And it is one of the prices probably of living in the world with this many people. So art is certainly interested in the end product of industrialization. So what does all of this mean, this manufacturing? This means that you can go places easily and buy a car. This means that you can go to a grocery store and buy food. You don't have to scavenge it yourself. You don't have to hunt it yourself. You can simply go to the local store and buy stuff. And our choices sometimes are not the healthiest choices. With this supermarket shopper here by Dwayne Hansen, we are seeing definitely a shopper whose shopping choices appear to be mostly sugary drinks, processed foods, and not a lot of fresh options on her in her diet. It's not doing her very good either, is it, physically? She has sores on her arms. She has really come dressed very casually and is smoking a cigarette also while shopping and has kind of a 1,000-yard stare. I don't think it's brought her happiness. So commodity fetishism is the social relations between people. Who makes what, who works for whom, the production time for a commodity are perceived as economic relations among objects. So the fetishism is the perception of the social relationships involved in the production, not as relationships amongst people, but as economic relationships among the money and the commodity exchanged in market trade. So the commodification has changed everything about human activity. You are judged in the quality of the clothes you buy, the quality of the smartphone you have. You are looked at as someone who purchases something rather than what you might stand for as a human being. And by the way, anything you stand for, you can buy the t-shirt that lets us know what you stand for. This is a Barbara Kruger artwork that says, "I shop, therefore I am," and kind of explains the commodity fetishism in the ways that consumers work. Now, also when we look at the work of Jeff Koons, we'll see the evidence of television that begins in the late 40s and really comes of age in the 1950s, where now most Americans share not a book that they've read, but a television show that they've watched, and that's certainly true today. Also becoming part of popular culture is not only television, but popular music, spread through radio and through buying records on vinyl, and of course the explosion of rock and roll music. So through all of this in the 1960s, a new kind of art forms called pop art. So pop art is taking advantage of our shared knowledge of popular magazines, popular television shows, comic books, songs, and also using ephemera, in this case by Richard Hamilton, of things that you would find in those magazines. And then also our purchasing power, the canned ham here, the candy that is here. You can see that the comic book has been turned into an artwork. And all of this probably perfected in the silk screens of Andy Warhol, where he is working in popular images from newspapers, usually scenes of death, and then also his paintings of celebrities like Marilyn Monroe. We see pop art also from the painter James Rosenquist in the 1960s. He was making images that to him summed up what America stood for, what America was. So here we're looking at a painting of an automobile, and we have seen how the automobile mass manufactured by Henry Ford and Chevrolet and other companies, how they are uniquely American. The middle image, we are seeing an image implying sex and sexual relations. So what is America? Cars, sex, and Franco-American spaghetti, a cheap spaghetti that you can buy in a can rather than making your own or having anything more authentic. So we're going to find pop art, we're going to find manufacturing and casting in the work of Jeff Koons, and we're also seeing from Jeff Koons the result of minimalism. So in minimalism, this is Donald Judd here, he was trying to make the whole work of art without any confusion. In other words, when you're looking at these rectangles on a wall, that's what they are. There's no meaning behind them. There is nothing other than the direct, a one-to-one relationship that you're having with these manufactured steel sculptures. So Donald is not making any of his own work. He is having factories produce stuff that looks factory-made. Another important thing that happens in the 60s is conceptual art. So in conceptual art, here the work of John Baldessari. He is taking photos that he is finding and then covering them with these mass-produced circular adhesive dots. So his mass-produced colored dots are used in kind of color-coded ways. Red is dangerous, green is safe, blue is platonic, yellow is crazy. He is using these mass-produced items that had no specific meaning maybe in their own production, and then making meaning in the art that he is making, and yet he's not making anything. He is finding everything and simply assembling them together. And this is where we come to Jeff Koons. I'm going to have you watch a documentary on Jeff Koons. I think the first 20 minutes is especially what you want to spend your time on. So this is Jeff Koons here. He is a pop artist working in things like the tulips in the background, the giant balloon dog. So he's taking images from children's birthday parties, from pop culture. We saw a Michael Jackson sculpture earlier that he made. Now, Jeff is not actually making the stuff with his hands. He is hiring people to make the stuff that he is designating for them to make. So he's finding the craftsmen and has the money to pay these craftsmen to realize his sculptures. And his sculptures are using a colored liquefied steel in the casting process, and they have become quite popular. So we see here this metallic ballerina, almost looks like a Disney ballerina done in the colored steel. It's shiny, it's gorgeous, it's large. The same thing here with the giant heart. It looks like something you might find in a Hallmark card store, and that you would send this to a love of yours, and it would be, plastic, and maybe the ribbon is made out of some sort of plastic or paper. And, you might, the person might really enjoy this cheap thing that you've given them with their Valentine card. And Koons has made both of these things large, out of steel, very valuable, very shiny. And you spend a lot of time looking at yourself reflected in the steel. So the work is not just about looking at the work. It is about also seeing yourself in the process. Here I'm describing kind of Koons' early work, where he attended the Maryland Institute College of Art and learned about things like conceptual art and how to talk about art. So here, one of his early works, he is simply buying things. He has bought these vacuum cleaners, and then he has had these plastic boxes made, the clear plastic boxes that are air sealed. He also bought fluorescent lights. So now these brand new vacuum cleaners are forever going to stay new in their shiny, lit atmospheres. And what we're looking at is the beauty of the industrial casting process, the casting that made the bodies, that made the plastic for the suction devices, the range of buying different vacuum cleaners, and what they all look like when they're lit dramatically. This is where Jeff Koons, I think his career really takes off. Jeff also has done realistic paintings. This is a painting of Jeff and his wife at the time, Leona. They did a series of work called Made in Heaven that was based on art from the Rococo period, kind of frivolous, rich people, nude in idealized scenes of nature, having orgies and sex and picnics and stuff like that. And Jeff does the same thing, but rather than photographs that were taken are then turned into massive paintings. So this is a massive painting of Jeff. And it didn't do very well. And also his relationship with his wife also didn't do very well. So Jeff, I think he's a difficult character. In many ways, it's easy to like the balloon dog and the tulips when you go to the Broad Museum. It's very easy to get caught up in how shiny they are, how big they are, how playful they are. But there's something about Jeff himself that is a bit unsavory. And I think you'll see that in the documentary that we're going to watch. He just comes off as being a little bit duplicitous. He comes off as not being necessarily truthful. I like his artwork better when he doesn't talk. The Hennessy, The Civilized Way to Lay Down the Law, is a painting and of an advertisement. And then in this show with luxury and degradation, we're seeing the paintings on the left and then also the steel sculpture on the right. The steel sculpture would have been filled with whiskey. This was a type of object that you would have received in the 60s or the 70s if you drank a lot of this whiskey, kept the bottle caps, sent the bottle caps to the manufacturer. They would send you this prize for being a good consumer. So what he's saying about this work is, I tried to show people that they should learn to preserve their political and economic power rather than strive for luxury. So in Hennessy, the civilized way to lay down the law, the world's most civilized spirit, we are seeing the law student late at night who, rather than continuing to study and continuing to strive to figure out whatever it is he's struggling with in his legal studies, they have decided instead to drink expensive whiskey. And so I kind of see what he's going for here. And the same thing with the Jim Beam observation car, right? Like this idea that you're having some luxury and that this luxury is taking away maybe from something. Or in the Jim Beam car, you're only buying this one product to receive the prize. So in a way, you are being degraded by only buying this one thing with this lure of something special coming your way. And I think the work has merit in terms of what Jeff is doing here. But he also says in the interview, he says, sometimes I take a helicopter to travel to my farm, but I don't live a luxurious lifestyle. So that becomes kind of part of what Made in Heaven was about, and then the work he makes now. Jeff was a Wall Street trader. Jeff understood the idea of the massive amounts of money that could come into art, the way that art could appreciate faster than real estate and stocks. And the artwork that he's making is seemingly all about money. And is that what great art is all about? Bigger, shinier, better, what we buy, watching rich people frolic and have sex? Right? Is that what it's all about? Is that what great art is? And that is somewhat my question to you. I kind of end the lecture showing you that his gallerist and him appear to be running a Ponzi scheme where they are getting millions of dollars for Jeff to make the art, but that millions of dollars they are spending on other things. So for them to make the artwork, they are having to get somebody else to buy art on spec. And so they're kind of getting behind. One of the things that Jeff is now making is he's gotten rid of using the shiny steel to make the tulips, the dancers, and all the other stuff. He's now making these gazing balls. So these kind of plaster reproductions of Greek and Roman statues, and then the colored steel gazing balls, because people don't even want to see art. They just want to see themselves reflected in the art. And so it appears that he is all about money to the point that he is taking advantage of other wealthy people who are depositing money for sculptures and then not getting them on time because they don't have that money to manufacture them. They got to get the money. It's a Ponzi scheme or a pyramid scheme. Here we're seeing, I think, something that stands kind of for what Jeff is. You have taken the Venus of Willendorf, if you remember from our Paleolithic lecture, made out of balloons, massive sculpture here, several $1 million, but maybe you don't have several $1 million. Maybe you have the $10,000 or $15,000 to buy a smaller version. Or possibly you could buy the wine bottle with the label of the Venus of Willendorf balloon sculpture for maybe several $100s. So notice the commodification of Jeff into expensive, medium, less expensive. All right, so what I want you to do with this in our discussion pull up my head here to end this. All right, so I want you to watch a documentary on Jeff Koons. You're going to see his artwork. He's going to talk about his artwork rather than me talking about them. And then also different art critics and art historians are going to talk about him, good and bad. And I want you to kind of come up with opinions of, do you like his art? What do you think about him? Is he being truthful with us when he talks about his art? And then in this documentary from the BBC, they don't own the rights for the musical breaks. In the musical breaks, they're playing the opening of the song by Led Zeppelin, When the Levee Breaks. So anytime that there's any silence where it's muted, this is what they're playing, the opening 15, 20 seconds of this. So if you want to know what's going on in the muted part, just take a listen to this, either while you're watching the documentary or before you watch the documentary, and then you'll kind of know what's going on. So the musical breaks aren't going to be that long. It'll just be a few seconds from one scene to another. And then also the Led Zeppelin part will fit into what Jeff is talking about as he's describing the Popeye sculpture in the opening part of the documentary. Okay, so that's it for Sculpture today. I look forward to seeing your thoughts on Jeff Koons. I definitely kind of love and hate him, and I really look forward to see your insight as well. Talk to you soon.